The last person I expected to laugh during our divorce hearing was my husband. But he did. He smiled at me like everything had gone exactly according to his plan. 10 minutes later, the judge opened one folder, and I watched that smile disappear forever. My name is Hannah. I'm 32 years old, and 6 months ago, I walked into a divorce courtroom believing I already knew exactly how my story would end. My husband, Ryan, had spent the previous year making sure I felt completely defeated. Every conversation became an argument. Every disagreement somehow became my fault. By the time the divorce papers were signed, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me in the mirror. The hardest part wasn't losing my marriage. It was realizing the man I had trusted for almost 10 years had been quietly planning my downfall long before I even realized we were falling apart. When I entered the courtroom that morning, Ryan was already sitting beside his expensive lawyer. He looked calm. Too calm. The moment our eyes met, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a sad smile. It was the smile of someone who believed he had already won. That smile terrified me more than anything he had said during the previous 12 months. Because people don't smile like that unless they know something you don't. I sat down beside my attorney and tried to ignore him, but I could still feel his eyes following every movement I made. He looked completely relaxed, almost amused, as if this wasn't the end of a marriage but the final scene of a movie he had already watched. Then he quietly leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something. Both of them laughed. That was the exact moment I realized this wasn't going to be an ordinary divorce hearing. I had absolutely no idea that before the judge left that courtroom, one ordinary-looking folder would destroy everything Ryan had spent years building. 3 months earlier, I still believed our marriage could be saved. From the outside, Ryan and I looked like the kind of couple people envied. We had the beautiful house, the expensive car in the driveway, the vacation photos on the wall, and the kind of life that made people say, "You two really made it." But inside that house, everything had already started falling apart. Ryan was rarely home before midnight anymore. At first, he said it was business dinners, late meetings, emergency calls with clients. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I had spent years helping him build his company from nothing, and I knew how much pressure he was under. But then his phone started staying face down on the table. His office door started staying locked. And every time I walked into the room while he was texting, his smile disappeared just a little too quickly. The first real crack came on a Tuesday night. He had left his phone on the kitchen counter while taking a shower. I wasn't trying to spy on him. I was only putting away dishes when the screen lit up beside me. One message appeared. Just one. But it was enough to make my hands go cold. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. I hate pretending she doesn't exist." I stood there staring at those words while the sound of running water echoed from upstairs. For almost 10 years, I had trusted that man with everything I had. My money, my time, my loyalty, my future. And in 1 second, a message from a stranger made me feel like I had been living inside a story where everyone knew the ending except me. 3 days passed, but I couldn't forget that message. Ryan acted like nothing had happened. He kissed me goodbye every morning, asked how my day was, even brought home my favorite coffee one afternoon. If I hadn't seen those words with my own eyes, I probably would have convinced myself I imagined everything. Instead, I started paying attention. For the first time in our marriage, I noticed how often he left the room to answer phone calls, how he always carried his phone in his pocket, even inside our own house. He changed the password I had known for years without saying a word. Every little detail by itself meant nothing. Together, they painted a picture I didn't want to believe. One Friday evening, he came downstairs wearing a suit that was far too expensive for an ordinary business dinner. "Don't wait up," he said, while fixing his tie in the hallway mirror. "What time will you be home?" I asked. He didn't even look at me. "Late." The front door closed behind him. I stood there listening to the silence. Then I walked to the living room window and watched his car disappear at the end of our street. For almost 10 years, I had trusted that man without question. That night, I made the decision that changed everything. I grabbed my car keys, and for the first time in my life, I followed my own husband. The rain grew heavier as I followed Ryan across the city. I stayed several cars behind him, careful not to make the same turn at the exact moment he did. Every red light felt like a gamble. If I got too close, he might recognize my headlights. If I fell too far behind, I'd lose him completely. After nearly 30 minutes, he left the busy downtown streets and drove into an older industrial district I had never visited before. Empty warehouses stretched along both sides of the road, their broken windows reflecting the orange glow of streetlights. There wasn't another car in sight. Ryan finally slowed down. He pulled into the parking lot of a worn-out brick building with no company sign, no lights, and no reason for anyone to be there at nearly 11 o'clock at night. I parked half a block away and turned off my engine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Ryan stepped out of his car. He wasn't alone. A woman was already waiting near the entrance. She walked toward him without hesitation. He smiled. She smiled back. My heart dropped. Every terrible thought that had haunted me over the last few days suddenly felt real. I watched them exchange a few quiet words before she unlocked the heavy metal door. Ryan looked over his shoulder one last time. Then the two of them disappeared inside the building. I sat frozen behind the steering wheel. I knew I had one choice left. Either I drove home and spent the rest of my life wondering, or I walked through that door and finally learned the truth. I quietly stepped out of my car and crossed the empty parking lot, keeping close to the side of the building. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. My footsteps echoed across the wet pavement, and my heart pounded so hard I was sure someone inside could hear it. The heavy metal door hadn't fully closed. A thin strip of warm light spilled into the darkness. I carefully moved closer. Voices. Ryan's voice. I couldn't make out every word, but I heard enough to know he wasn't talking to just one person. There were several people inside. I slowly pushed the door open another inch. What I saw made absolutely no sense. There were no candles, no romantic dinner, no hotel room, no affair. Instead, dozens of people filled the old warehouse. Some were carrying boxes. Others were organizing clothes, blankets, and food. Children were sitting together in one corner while volunteers handed them hot meals. The woman who had greeted Ryan wasn't his girlfriend. She was wearing a volunteer badge. Ryan took off his expensive jacket, rolled up his sleeves, picked up 2 heavy boxes, and carried them across the room without saying a word. I stood frozen in the doorway. For days, I had convinced myself I was about to catch my husband cheating. Instead, I was looking at something I never could have imagined. I was about to leave. Embarrassment burned through every part of me. I had spent days convincing myself Ryan was living a double life. Instead, I had just watched him spend his Friday night helping complete strangers. I quietly stepped backward, hoping no one had noticed me. "Can I help you?" The voice came from behind. I turned around so quickly I almost lost my balance. An older woman stood a few feet away, holding a clipboard. She wasn't angry. She looked concerned. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I thought this was something else." She studied my face for a few seconds before asking a question that made my stomach drop. "You're Ryan's wife, aren't you?" I couldn't answer. She smiled gently. "I've been wondering when you'd finally come." My heart skipped a beat. "You know who I am?" She nodded. "Ryan talks about you all the time." Nothing about tonight made sense anymore. I looked past her and saw Ryan laughing with a little boy as they carried boxes of canned food together. It wasn't the fake smile he wore in business meetings. It looked real. The woman noticed where I was looking. "He's been coming here almost every Friday for over 3 years," she said quietly. 3 years? I repeated. She nodded again. He asked us never to tell anyone, especially you. I frowned. Why would he keep something like this a secret? The woman took a slow breath. Because this place exists for people who are hiding from someone. We protect families escaping violence. We protect children who have nowhere else to go. I felt every assumption I had made over the past week begin to crumble. Maybe. I hadn't been following a cheating husband after all. I wanted to walk inside and apologize. Instead, I stood there in complete silence, trying to understand why the man I had spent the last week suspecting had hidden something so important from me. Then I noticed the expression on the older woman's face. She wasn't finished. Ryan isn't the reason you're getting divorced, she said softly. I stared at her. What do you mean? She looked toward Ryan, making sure he couldn't hear us. Everything you think happened isn't what happened. My pulse quickened. She led me into a small office tucked away behind the warehouse floor. It was a tiny room with an old wooden desk, 2 chairs, and shelves overflowing with paperwork. She opened one of the filing cabinets. Then she pulled out a thick manila folder. My name was written across the front. I froze. Ryan left this with us months ago, she said quietly. He told us that if the divorce ever reached court, this folder had to be given to the judge. My hands began to shake. What is it? She didn't answer. Instead, she placed the folder in front of me. Slowly, I opened it. The first page was a copy of our joint bank statements. The second page contained private financial records I had never seen before. The third page made my heart stop. It wasn't evidence against me. It was evidence that someone had been stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from Ryan's company, using my name. I looked up at her, completely speechless. She met my eyes and quietly said the words that changed everything. Ryan never believed you did it. I wanted to walk inside and apologize. Instead, I stood there in complete silence, trying to understand why the man I had spent the last week suspecting had hidden something so important from me. Then I noticed the expression on the older woman's face. She wasn't finished. Ryan isn't the reason you're getting divorced, she said softly. I stared at her. What do you mean? She looked toward Ryan, making sure he couldn't hear us. Everything you think happened isn't what happened. My pulse quickened. She led me into a small office tucked away behind the warehouse floor. It was a tiny room with an old wooden desk, 2 chairs, and shelves overflowing with paperwork. She opened one of the filing cabinets. Then she pulled out a thick manila folder. My name was written across the front. I froze. Ryan left this with us months ago, she said quietly. He told us that if the divorce ever reached court, this folder had to be given to the judge. My hands began to shake. What is it? She didn't answer. Instead, she placed the folder in front of me. Slowly, I opened it. The first page was a copy of our joint bank statements. The second page contained private financial records I had never seen before. The third page made my heart stop. It wasn't evidence against me. It was evidence that someone had been stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from Ryan's company, using my name. I looked up at her, completely speechless. She met my eyes and quietly said the words that changed everything. Ryan never believed you did it. The judge adjusted his glasses and slowly turned another page. Then another. The silence inside the courtroom became almost unbearable. Ryan's lawyer stood up. Your Honor, I object. We haven't had the opportunity to review these documents. The judge didn't even look up. You'll have your opportunity. He continued reading, page after page. Every document told the same story. Hidden accounts, forged signatures, offshore transfers, shell companies. None of them belonged to me. Every single transaction led back to one person. Ryan. I looked across the courtroom. The confidence that had filled his face only minutes earlier was gone. He wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't even looking at me. He stared at the folder like he had just seen a ghost. His attorney leaned over and whispered something urgently. Ryan didn't respond. The judge finally closed the folder. He looked directly at Ryan. "Mr. Carter." His deep voice echoed through the silent courtroom. "Would you like to explain why your wife's electronic signature appears on documents that were created while she was in another country?" Ryan swallowed. For the first time since I had met him, he had no answer. The judge opened another envelope that had been inside the folder. It contained photographs, security camera images, bank surveillance footage, email records, travel records, one by one. Every piece of evidence destroyed another lie Ryan had carefully built over the past 3 years. His lawyer slowly sat back down. He knew the case was over. Ryan finally looked at me. Not with anger, not with hatred, with fear. Real fear. Because he had just realized the divorce was no longer the biggest problem in his life. No one spoke. The courtroom felt frozen in time. Ryan's attorney slowly stood up again, but this time there was no confidence left in his voice. "Your Honor, my client would like a short recess." The judge looked directly at him. Denied. He closed the folder and folded his hands. "Mr. Carter, the evidence presented today raises far more serious issues than this divorce proceeding." Ryan finally found his voice. "This is a misunderstanding." The judge didn't respond. Instead, he picked up one photograph from the evidence. Security footage. Ryan standing alone inside the company's accounting office long after every employee had gone home. Then another. Bank surveillance. Ryan personally withdrawing large amounts of cash from an account that officially didn't exist. Then another. An email chain. Instructions. Fake invoices. Forged electronic signatures. Every page connected perfectly to the next. The judge slowly removed his glasses. "I've served on this bench for 27 years. He looked directly at Ryan. "I've seen greed. I've seen betrayal. I've seen families destroyed by money. But I've rarely seen a scheme this carefully planned." Ryan's face turned completely pale. His attorney quietly closed his briefcase. He already knew there was nothing left to argue. The judge reached for the phone beside his bench. "I'm ordering that copies of this evidence be immediately transferred to the Financial Crimes Division." The entire courtroom gasped. Ryan shot to his feet. "You can't do this!" His voice echoed through the room. The judge remained completely calm. "I already have." 2 uniformed court officers stepped through the courtroom doors. Ryan looked around desperately. His expensive lawyer wouldn't even meet his eyes. For the first time since our marriage began, he was completely alone. Ryan didn't resist. He couldn't. As the 2 court officers approached him, he slowly lowered himself back into his chair. His hands were shaking, not with anger, with fear. The judge looked across the courtroom one final time before speaking. "Mrs. Carter?" He paused. "I believe you deserve to know why this evidence was never presented before today." I looked toward him. The judge lifted one final document from the folder. It was dated almost 8 months earlier. Ryan had written a signed statement. Not for the court. For me. My heart began pounding. The judge quietly read part of it aloud. "If you're reading this, it means everything went wrong. Hannah never stole a single dollar. She never signed those documents. Every signature was created using software I purchased. I told myself I was only borrowing the money. Then I kept lying until there was no way back." The room was completely silent. Even Ryan couldn't look at me anymore. Tears slowly rolled down his face. "I never wanted her to pay for what I did," he whispered, his voice barely carried across the courtroom. "I was going to confess. But every time I tried, I got scared." The judge carefully closed the folder. "Fear," he said quietly, "doesn't erase responsibility." Ryan closed his eyes. For years, he had controlled every conversation, every argument, every decision. Now, he had nothing left to hide behind. And for the first time since our marriage began, he admitted the truth. The hearing ended less than 20 minutes later. Ryan was no longer surrounded by confident lawyers. He was surrounded by court officers. As they escorted him toward the courtroom doors, he stopped. Slowly. He turned around to face me one last time. Our eyes met. For nearly 10 years, I had imagined growing old with that man, building a family, growing a business together, living the life we had always planned. Instead, we stood on opposite sides of a courtroom, separated by lies, silence, and choices that could never be undone. "I'm sorry, Hannah." His voice cracked. It was the first genuine apology I had ever heard from him. Months earlier, I would have given anything to hear those words. Now, they meant nothing. Not because I hated him, but because forgiveness couldn't erase everything that had happened. I quietly nodded, not for him, for myself. The judge gathered his papers and left the courtroom. The spectators slowly began walking out. Within minutes, the room that had held the biggest moment of my life became completely silent. I picked up the now empty folder from the table, the same ordinary folder that had changed everything. It felt surprisingly light. As I walked toward the exit, sunlight poured through the courthouse windows. For the first time in years, I didn't feel betrayed. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel victorious. I felt free. And sometimes, freedom is worth far more than winning. 1 year passed. People often ask me if I ever saw Ryan again. The answer is only once. Not in a courtroom, not in prison, not even by choice. I received a single handwritten letter. There was no return address. Inside was only one page. No excuses, no requests, no attempt to change the past. Just a few simple words. I spent years trying to protect my reputation. In the end, I lost everything that actually mattered. I hope one day you find the happiness I was too blind to appreciate. I folded the letter. Then I placed it into a drawer. I never opened it again. Some endings don't need another conversation. Some apologies arrive years too late. A few months after the trial, I returned to the same volunteer shelter. This time, I didn't come looking for answers. I came to help. The older woman greeted me with the same gentle smile. "I had a feeling you'd come back," she said. I smiled. So did I. Every Friday evening became part of my new life. Packing food, sorting donations, reading stories to children, listening to women who believed their lives were over, just as I once believed mine was. Then one little girl ran up to me and wrapped her arms around my waist. "Thank you for coming back," she whispered. At that moment, I realized something. The courtroom hadn't been the end of my story. It had simply been the beginning of a better one.